Welcome, horror fans. Today, Mr. Horror has three bone-chilling stories to share with you. Get ready to be scared out of your wits as we journey through the twisted minds of some truly terrifying characters. Miss Gray was a new teacher at St. Mary's High School. She was young, beautiful, and intelligent, and the students were enamored with her. But there was something unsettling about her. Her piercing stare made the students feel uncomfortable, and her smile seemed to be hiding something sinister. One day, during a biology lesson, Miss Gray asked her students to participate in an experiment. She asked them to close their eyes and focus on their breathing. The students were hesitant, but they did as they were told. As they closed their eyes, they could hear the sound of Miss Gray's heels walking around the classroom. Suddenly, they heard a loud scream, and they all opened their eyes to see one of their classmates on the floor, writhing in pain. Miss Gray calmly walked over to the student and helped her to her feet. She explained that it was just a simulation to demonstrate the effects of a sudden loud noise on the body, but the students couldn't shake the feeling that something was off about their new teacher. As the weeks went on, Miss Gray's behavior became increasingly erratic. She would switch between being overly friendly and overly strict, and her lessons became more and more disturbing. The students began to dread going to her class, and rumors began to circulate about her past. Despite their concerns, the school administration seemed to turn a blind eye to Miss Gray's behavior. It wasn't until it was too late that they realized the gravity of the situation. One day, a student reported seeing Miss Gray in a dark alley behind the school, speaking to someone who they couldn't identify. The school administration finally took action and decided to investigate. What they found was horrifying. Miss Gray had been living a double life as a member of a cult. She had been indoctrinating her students and had even been recruiting them to join the cult. The screams the students had heard in her classroom were not just simulations, but actual physical torture that she had been inflicting on herself to demonstrate her devotion to the cult. The school administration immediately fired Miss Gray and reported her to the authorities, but the damage had already been done. Many of her former students had been traumatized by her teachings and struggled to overcome the emotional scars that she had left behind. As for Miss Gray, she was never seen or heard from again. The authorities were never able to locate her, and it was rumored that she had fled the country to avoid prosecution. But for those who had been in her class, the memory of Miss Gray and her terrifying teachings would haunt them for the rest of their lives. Despite the investigation and Miss Gray's termination, the school and the students were left to deal with the aftermath of her actions. Many students struggled with anxiety and PTSD, and some even dropped out of school as a result. The school took steps to ensure that this never happened again, implementing stricter background checks for new hires and increased mental health support for students. However, the memory of Miss Gray and her cult still lingered, and it became a topic of conversation for years to come. Years later, a former student of Miss Gray's was walking home from work when she heard the sound of footsteps behind her. She turned around to see a figure in the distance, wearing a black robe and a hood. As the figure got closer, she realized that it was Miss Gray. The former student froze in fear as Miss Gray approached her, a chilling smile on her face. "You can never truly escape the cult," she whispered, before disappearing into the darkness. The former student was left shaken and traumatized once again, but this time she knew she had to speak out. She reported the encounter to the police, and a thorough investigation was launched. However, once again, Miss Gray seemed to have disappeared without a trace. To this day, the former student wonders if she will ever truly be free from Miss Gray and the cult that she had brought into their lives. And she warns others to always be wary of the teachers and authority figures in their lives, as they may not always have their best interests at heart. Mrs. Williams was the new music teacher at Jefferson Middle School. She was an odd character from the start, with her dark clothing and stoic expression. The students found her to be unapproachable and cold, but it was her teaching methods that really made them uncomfortable. During one of her classes, Mrs. Williams instructed the students to close their eyes and focus on their breathing, much like Miss Gray in the previous story. But this time, when the students opened their eyes, Mrs. Williams was standing at the front of the classroom holding a large knife. The students were frozen with fear as Mrs. Williams began to recite a strange chant in a language they couldn't understand. She then started to slowly move the knife towards her own throat as if to harm herself. The students were horrified and begged her to stop, but she just kept chanting and moving the knife closer and closer to her throat. Finally, one brave student tackled her to the ground and the knife was taken away. Mrs. Williams was suspended from teaching and the police were called to investigate. It turned out that she had a history of mental illness and had stopped taking her medication. She was committed to a mental hospital for treatment, and the students were left to deal with the aftermath of their traumatic experience. They struggled to understand how a seemingly normal teacher could become so unhinged, and the memory of Mrs. Williams and her strange chanting haunted them for a long time. The incident also raised questions about mental health resources and support for teachers in schools. Despite the administration's attempts to keep the incident quiet, word spread quickly throughout the community. Parents became increasingly concerned about the safety of their children in school, and some even pulled their kids out of Jefferson Middle School altogether. As for the students who witnessed the incident, they received counseling and support from the school, but many still struggled with anxiety and fear in the aftermath. The incident left a lasting impact on the school and the community, serving as a stark reminder of the potential dangers that can arise when mental health issues are left untreated. Some students were unable to cope with the trauma and transferred to other schools, while others found solace in talking about their experience with each other. Mrs. Williams never returned to Jefferson Middle School, and her fate after being committed to the mental hospital remains unknown. The incident sparked conversations about mental health and the importance of providing support and resources to those who may be struggling. It also served as a reminder to students and staff to speak up if they notice concerning behavior in their peers or colleagues. Years later, the incident at Jefferson Middle School is still talked about among those who were there. The memory of Mrs. Williams and her bizarre chanting remains etched in their minds as a haunting reminder of the potential dangers that can lurk behind seemingly normal appearances. Mrs. Jackson was the new art teacher at Oak Ridge Elementary School. She was an older woman with gray hair and a permanent frown on her face. Her appearance alone was enough to make some of the younger students nervous, but it was her teaching methods that truly sent chills down their spines. During one of her classes, Mrs. Jackson instructed her students to draw a portrait of themselves. As the students began to work, Mrs. Jackson began to walk around the room, stopping at each student's desk to look at their work. When she reached one particular student's desk, she let out a gasp and grabbed the portrait from the student's hands. She then proceeded to shred the drawing into tiny pieces and throw them into the trash. The student was devastated and confused, not understanding what they had done wrong. When they asked Mrs. Jackson why she had done that, she simply replied with a cold stare and said, "You know what you did." Over the next few weeks, Mrs. Jackson's behavior became increasingly erratic. She would lash out at students for no apparent reason and seemed to take pleasure in tearing apart their artwork. Some students even reported hearing her muttering to herself in the classroom after hours. Despite the growing concerns of the students and their parents, the school administration did nothing to address Mrs. Jackson's behavior. It wasn't until a parent-teacher conference that the truth was finally uncovered. During the conference, one parent mentioned to Mrs. Jackson that their child had been feeling uneasy in her class. Mrs. Jackson's demeanor suddenly changed, and she began to speak in a strange language that no one could understand. The parent immediately left the room and contacted the school administration. When they arrived, they found Mrs. Jackson sitting in a trance-like state, surrounded by symbols and drawings that appeared to be of a demonic nature. The school administration quickly fired Mrs. Jackson and called in a priest to perform an exorcism on the classroom. But the damage had already been done. Many students were traumatized by the experience and struggled to overcome the fear and anxiety that Mrs. Jackson had instilled in them. The incident also sparked an investigation into Mrs. Jackson's background, revealing a disturbing history of mental illness and involvement in a cult. It was discovered that Mrs. Jackson had been using her position as a teacher to recruit young students into the cult and was even performing dark rituals in the classroom after hours. The school and the community were left reeling from the shocking revelations. The parents of the affected students filed a lawsuit against the school for failing to protect their children from a dangerous and unstable teacher. As for Mrs. Jackson, she was committed to a psychiatric hospital for treatment, but her influence had already left a lasting impact on the lives of her former students, who struggled to come to terms with the darkness that they had been exposed to. The incident served as a wake-up call for the school and the community, highlighting the need for better mental health resources and support for both students and teachers. It also served as a reminder of the importance of vigilance when it comes to the safety and well-being of children in schools. The Oak Ridge Elementary School incident left a lasting impact on everyone involved. The parents of the affected students continued to fight for justice, pushing for better policies and protections in schools to prevent similar incidents from happening in the future. The school administration also implemented new measures to ensure the safety of their students, including stricter background checks for teachers and mandatory mental health evaluations. Despite the measures taken, the students who were traumatized by Mrs. Jackson's actions continued to struggle with anxiety and fear, and many of them required ongoing counseling and therapy to overcome the trauma. In the years that followed, the incident faded from public memory, but for those who lived through it, the memory of Mrs. Jackson and her disturbing behavior would never be forgotten. The incident served as a stark reminder of the potential dangers that can arise when mental illness is left untreated, and the importance of taking swift action to protect vulnerable students from harm. Thank you for watching these 3 chilling stories about creepy school teachers. We hope they gave you goosebumps and kept you on the edge of your seat. If you enjoyed these stories, please subscribe to our channel and turning on notifications to stay updated on our latest content. We appreciate your support and look forward to bringing you more thrilling tales in the future. Remember to always stay vigilant and speak up if you ever feel unsafe in a school or any other environment. Thank you for watching, and we'll see you in the next story.